So welcome back to Chapter 15, Part 2. We're just going to talk a little quickly here about how ocean circulation affects weather. And one of the things that we're going to focus on once again is this equator. Remember that the equator is where the vast majority of the energy from the sun is hitting at the most dense. And of course, that's going to make the water really quite warm. Now, you also need to remember that the Earth is spinning on its own axis. Remember, it's a little tilted, but it's spinning on its own axis. And what's happening to the water is that the water is the land is moving in this direction, right? The Earth is spinning kind of in this direction, but the water doesn't spin quite as fast as the land does, and so there's a little bit of lag. And so that means that the water is actually circulating in this direction. In the northern hemisphere, we get this clockwise rotation of water, and in the southern hemisphere, it ends up being counterclockwise. No, it is not true that in the southern hemisphere, toilets swirl in the opposite direction as the northern hemisphere. That's completely made up. It totally has to do with the way the water flows into that toilet. So don't buy into that myth. All right, so back to ocean circulation. And again, we're going to focus on the northern hemisphere, just because that's where we live. We'll visit the southern hemisphere too, and use the lessons that we learned. So the warm water is circulating, and it's circulating here, and of course it's going to hit the land, but this is warm, very warm air and warm water. And some of that warm water is going to come up here and it's going to help change the ecosystem to a grassland and a temperate deciduous forest like we see over here, by the way. So that warm, moist air is so I keep saying air, water is circulating up, and it goes up and it goes around the eastern coast of North America, and as it gets farther and farther and farther away from the equator, it starts to cool down. As it cools down, right, it's still circulating in that clockwise direction, and it goes over here towards Europe, and it basically stays cool for a really long time. Goes along the coast of Western Europe, down the coast of Mexico, Africa. What the heck? Goes down the coast of Africa, and it still stays pretty cool until it gets to the equator, where it starts to warm up again. All right, we're going to use that same lesson going on into the northern Pacific Ocean. Warm water goes up and around towards Alaska, cools down along the western coast of North America, stays pretty cool, and then as it approaches the equator, warms up. So this is going to be a pretty big difference between, for example, the western coast of North America and the eastern coast of North America. On the western coast of North America, that water in the Pacific is pretty cool. And in fact, if you ever swim in the Pacific Ocean, and you're going to spend a lot of time out there, you're definitely going to want a wetsuit on. However, that same latitude in North America on the eastern coast, that water is warm. And so LA, going over here to like the Carolinas, and you've got warm water. So you don't need to have a wetsuit in order to go surfing on the East Coast, whereas on the West Coast you do. And of course, these differences in temperature absolutely are going to affect the weather. Think about if you've ever been to LA or San Diego, you've got very moderate temperatures, especially along the coast. If you start to get inland, it gets kind of hot. But along the coast, those very moderate temperatures, and that's because it's the cool Pacific water. Same latitude, but on the eastern coast of North America. And what you start to see is quite warm temperatures, and that's because of the warm water. Same rules apply to South America. The eastern coast of South America is got some nice warm water flowing along it, but the western coast of South America has got a long stretch of cool water flowing across it. So we would not experience the same temperatures at the same latitude in South America. Remember that there's a big mountain range in North America right here. Turns out there's a big mountain range in South America right here. So, and of course the wind is blowing from this direction. So we get our deserts here in South America, and we get a little bit of desert along the western coast, and that's because of the rain shadow effect. So this is why North and South America are kind of wonky when it comes to the location of the deserts. All right, hopefully that makes sense. We are going to move on, though, away from weather and start talking about how energy is passed around an ecosystem. And this is probably information that you've been learning about for a while. We're talking about food chains and food webs. So I'm just going to introduce some of these terms to you, and hopefully it will refresh your memory, or if you've never heard about it, it's fairly straightforward. Okay, so food chains. Food chains are just how energy is passed from the sun to the primary producers. Remember, we talked about the primary producers already, down the chain of what who eats who and what eats what until all the energy is passed along. So energy is converted from the sun by the primary producers in the process of photosynthesis. We already talked about that. Then that energy is passed on to some organisms that are known as primary consumers. You might have used the term herbivore before, and that applies, but the main term we're trying to focus on here is primary consumers. The first trophic level, that's this number one here, that's the primary producers, followed by the second trophic level, which is the primary consumers, or herbivores. They get their energy from eating plant material or any primary producer. The third level of our trophic cascade is called the secondary consumer. Again, the numbering system seems a little off. It's the third level, but it's the secondary consumer because, of course, we've got two different types of primaries, a primary producer and a primary consumer. Our secondary consumers are often referred to as carnivores, and so we've got this little snake eating this little, I don't know what that is, a mole, who knows, the artist's a little cray-cray right now. So that's our secondary consumer. And then you can have tertiary consumers, or those are also known as top carnivores, and a tertiary consumer is anything that eats a secondary consumer. You can actually have higher levels than the tertiary consumer in a food chain, but this is pretty rare. You can have something called a quaternary consumer, for example. They exist, but again, it's not as common as the secondary consumer and the tertiary consumer. Of course, life isn't quite as simple as a food chain, like I just stepped through here with you. You can also have a food web, and a food web is going to be thinking about the complexities that exist in the real world. So here, like there's not just one kind of primary producer, there's many kinds of primary producers. And there's not just one kind of primary consumer, there's many kind of primary consumers. So if we go down this pathway, we've got this cricket that's a primary consumer of this plant that's eaten by the chipmunk, which is eaten by the snake, which is eaten by the hawk. And if you count consumers, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Primary, secondary, tertiary, and our mystery quaternary consumer. So this hawk can be considered a tertiary consumer or a quaternary consumer, depending on the pathway that the energy got to the hawk. So hopefully that makes sense to you. Food webs are much more accurate, but they're harder to kind of think about like what position in the food chain this hawk exists at. It exists at multiple levels, multiple trophic levels in the food chain. Also, food chains and food webs really focus only on what eats what. And of course, there are other things that are important in moving energy around in an ecosystem. For example, everything dies and everything is decomposed. And so there are types of organisms called decomposers that break down dead and decaying organisms to recycle that energy into, to recycle the not the energy, but the chemicals in the food that it's decomposing. So decomposers are a very specific subset of these recyclers, really focusing on mold and bacteria, right? Like you see this mold growing here. There's another group of organisms that are animals that are called detritivores, and a detritivore is any animal that eats dead things. So this compost beetle here is eating this decomposing compost, which is really good. I mean, the poop from these compost beetles is very important, helps recycle material. Vultures are also an example of detritivores because vultures don't go around killing their own prey. They rely on things that are already dead. If you think about it, and this is a little gross, but if you think about it, you are a detritivore. Because when is the last time you went out and killed your own dinner? Like, maybe for some of you it was recently, but probably not. So, I mean, really, we're kind of detritivores. I guess in our natural system, we're going to be something called an omnivore, and an omnivore eats at multiple different levels. But we're also like not killing our own food anymore, so we're kind of detritivores. All right, so that's the levels of which the trophic levels of how energy is passed along from organism to organism. But it turns out that if you think about how this energy from the sun is captured by the primary producers and how much of that energy is passed on to the next trophic level, and just so you know, the word trophic level that I've been using is right there. It turns out that not very much of this energy is passed on from trophic level to trophic level. There's something called the 10% rule. And this is just a general rule of thumb that says that at each level, at each trophic level in this energy pyramid, only about 10% of that energy is actually converted into the physical biomass. That biomass just means like the physical structures of the body. Only about 10% of that energy found at one trophic level is converted into the physical biomass in the next trophic level. This has huge implications for how many top carnivores you can have in any given ecosystem. It's strictly limited. So if you have a huge amount of primary producers in an ecosystem, only 10% of that is available to the primary consumers, and only 10% of that is available to the secondary consumers, and so forth, which makes sense why we really don't have very many tertiary consumers, or even those very rare quaternary consumers that I've already mentioned to you. So that's what the 10% rule says. 90% of energy is lost, and I'm using that in quotes because it's not really lost. It's expended by the organisms that are alive using up that energy in a process called cellular respiration. We have already talked about cellular respiration back in the first video on one of the first slides where I was talking about energy. And I told you it would come back up again, and here it is. You, as an organism, you need to stay alive. You're going to use energy to stay alive, and you use up about 90% of that energy just in forcing yourself to stay alive. You lose some of it in your waste products as well, but basically you're using all that energy to stay alive. 10% is available for the next trophic level. And if you look at our pyramid here, you can see that these arrows, they're only going in one direction. We are only passing that energy up the food chain. And so what we say about energy is that energy flows in an ecosystem. Energy flows. It goes from the sun to the primary producers, and it flows following the 10% rule to the primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. It's a flow. We'll talk about how things cycle when we get into other topics in this chapter. So here's a few things for you to think about. If you have 10,000 pounds of grain, right? 10,000 pounds of corn or wheat or something along those lines. How much biomass could it support for each of the following? So how much biomass could it support of mice if you're only feeding that grain to mice? And following the 10% rule, we just say that's gonna, instead of 10,000 pounds, it's gonna be 1,000 pounds of mice. Of course, mice are eaten by snakes, and so this same 10,000 pounds of grain that gives you 1,000 pounds of mice is only going to give you 100 pounds of snake. And it's only going to give you 10 pounds of hawk. So that's, again, just kind of following the logic of this 10% rule. We can use this information to start thinking about what we were talking about in chapter 14, which is thinking about carrying capacity. So if you have the same 10,000 pounds of grain, how much biomass could it support if humans are eating cows? So how much human would be able to survive on that 10,000 pounds of grain if all of it's fed to the cow first? So the cow is going to be 1,000 pounds and you got 100 pounds of human. But if the humans are just directly eating that grain, if there's no carnivory happening here by us eating cows, then we can actually support way more humans. We can support 10 times as many humans if humans are eating a vegetarian style diet. Now, this is important to be thinking about for the future. I myself am a carnivore. I like to eat meat, but it might be that if we start reaching carrying capacity, that it's something that we'll have to kind of deal with. All right, so I told you we'd talk about cycles, and we use the term biogeochemical to refer to this type of cycles that we're going to be hitting. Your book brings up 3 biogeochemical cycles. I throw in a 4th one. You do need to know all 4 of these. It's in your study guide. So if you have not been paying attention to that study guide, please make sure you do. All right. So as we go through these biogeochemical cycles, there's going to be some things that are in common to all of them. And that thing is called a reservoir. And a reservoir is where you're going to find the chemicals that we're talking about, and you're going to find these chemicals in non-living parts of the environment. So every single one we'll be talking about, especially the ones that your book bring up, are focusing on this concept of a reservoir. And then organisms are going to take that chemical out of the reservoir. So one of the things we'll focus on is what exactly specific organisms are doing that taking of the chemical out of the reservoir. Then we're going to talk about how the chemical cycles through the food chain. And that, it turns out, is very consistent no matter which of the biogeochemical cycles that your book brings up. So these chemicals cycle through the food chain, which means that the chemicals can be used over and over and over again. This is very different from how energy works. Energy was a flow. It only went in one direction, but chemicals can be recycled and reused. It gets a little gross to think about, but here you go. So here, I'll do it in a not gross way. Think about, take a deep breath in and breathe out, and you're breathing out all this carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide that you're breathing out is going to be converted into oxygen by a primary producer. And that's going to be breathed in by somebody else. So, and it's recycled over and over and over again. So you are literally breathing in the oxygen that was breathed out, over the course of the entire life cycle of the planet for 4.6 billion years, basically. Historical figures, you are reusing the chemicals that your favorite historical figure. Mine's Darwin. So I'm breathing in the oxygen that Darwin breathed out in the form of carbon dioxide. I think that's kind of cool. All right, so again, eventually we're going to return that chemical to the reservoir, and here is a list of the 4 biogeochemical cycles that I'm going to step you through. 3 of them are from your book, and I'm going to elaborate on the water cycle because I think it's very important. So there's the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the water cycle. And we are going to start out with the carbon cycle. I always like to focus on the reservoir first. And for carbon, the reservoir is in the form of carbon dioxide. So we say that the reservoir is in the atmosphere, and all this carbon dioxide is sitting up there in the atmosphere, la-di-da, doing its thing, until a primary producer, in the presence of sunlight, takes that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and converts it into sugar through the process of photosynthesis. All's well and good. It's going to use up 90% of that energy from the sunlight, and 10% will be passed on. But a lot of that actual carbon from the carbon cycle is going to be passed on through the food chain to the primary consumer, the secondary consumer, the tertiary consumer. This is your food chain right here. We can also think about how everybody dies, everything poops, and this is a waste product. In the